big picture themes about the role of information in democracy and how much the people need to know about going to war, about, we had the defense of rhetoric followed by a much more skeptical view of rhetoric. So we've got lots to talk about, and we've got a great panel to do that. We have Michael Gerson, who's can talk about this from the inside in a way that I think few of us can, having actually written speeches for a president. And of course, I'm sure you all know him from his regular columns in the Washington Post. We also have Elizabeth Saunders, who's not only written about the relationship between JFK and Khrushchev, but it's also written more generally about leaders in international relations. And just in perusing her biography, I was struck that she is the 2012 winner of the Jervis Schroeder Best Book Award. So it's too bad that Bob's not here, but we do see that these things tend to come around. So we talked about having about 15, 20-minute long presentations from our speakers, and then have Joe and I ask some pointed questions as our moderator, and then we'll open up to the floor for discussion. And hopefully we should have plenty of time to wrap up around 3 o'clock. So I turn the floor over to you, and who wants to go first?
Mike, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, but let me join you.
So please welcome Michael Gerson.
Thank you very much. I'm genuinely honored to be part of this panel, and some people whose work I have great respect for. I'm approaching this as a practitioner, not as an academic, involved in 2 inaugurals and 6 State of the Union addresses and 2 convention speeches and anywhere from 1 to 3 public events we had a day at the White House. And I'm not going to dispute the fundamentals of Professor Nye's case. I think that I want to offer this fairly blindly obvious analytical insight. Sometimes a president has a communications problem, and sometimes the president has a reality problem. And the press and your supporters often have no idea which is which. So I'll give you a few examples. In 2005, following the re-election, President Bush decided to use his political capital to achieve Social Security reform, including individual accounts. After the State of the Union that year, where this was featured prominently, we made 60 visits in 60 days to sell the proposal. And it made almost no difference in politics or public opinion. The public views were set, they were durable, the debate was already polarized and partisan, and even at the height of the president's outreach, under normal circumstances, presidential communications are they gain a fraction of national attention. And I think President Obama, who is a very fine communicator, has found exactly the same thing on, say, an issue like gun control. His consistent efforts to raise this issue and change public views have really not worked. I saw this dynamic even more dramatically in the context of Iraq. The public opinion by 2005, 2006 had turned against the war. And I kept getting urgent emails from major leaders, people with very strong views, saying if only the president would say this, or if only he would adopt this formulation, that communications could be turned around on these set of problems. But we did not, at that point, have a rhetorical problem. We had a reality problem. We had a military strategy in place that was failing. And there were no magical words that could have changed it. But I also saw the other side of this, where the words, in a few instances, could matter greatly. I'm led every anniversary of September 11th to think back on those events. And the president's initial message and leadership following the September 11th attacks were really quite shaky. He was traveling around the country in Air Force One. He came back to the White House and delivered a very weak speech from the Oval Office. And then you had a change that was based on rhetoric that came on September 14th with the National Cathedral, at the National Cathedral, and then up here in New York on the rubble. They'll hear from us all. And then on September 20th with the speech to the joint session of Congress that was started to identify basic facts, who was al-Qaeda and what was the course of events moving forward. I think you could make the case, I remember thinking at the time, that the words that usually weren't that important mattered to the country in very, very practical ways. And it helped establish a set of foreign policy approaches at the beginnings of the War on Terror that have been practiced and even expanded by the current administration and really represent a tremendous and sometimes, for the administration, uncomfortable continuity in American policy. So I think that presidential rhetoric is sometimes oversold, and I think it's sometimes undersold. It generally has little power to shape reality and summon events. And it often has great influence on the interpretation of events and the shaping of national responses. I found the example in the book of FDR particularly instructive. I have great respect for Franklin Roosevelt's rhetoric. He was a great, ruthless, strategic, sometimes deceptive communicator. And he conducted, particularly after 1938, a multi-year campaign to edge America towards greater engagement in European conflict. And by the spring and summer of 1940, as the professor points out, about 10% of Americans supported sending our army abroad. That is a failure. And only Pearl Harbor changed that. But I'd also agree that it mattered greatly that FDR, rather than someone else, was there to shape this response to Pearl Harbor and the conduct of the war in distinctive ways. Other presidents might not have given the For Freedom speech in January of 1941, which became the foundation for the principles of the Atlantic Charter and the basis for the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and became important norms that have shaped history following World War II. And this is a different type of influence than measuring approval ratings before a State of the Union address and then afterwards and looking for trends. In the 1941 State of the Union address was not influential in that way, but it shaped the values of America at a time when America was coming to unprecedented promise and prominence. Roosevelt could not create the rain, but he could channel and direct the flood, and rhetoric played an important role. I think another great example is Lyndon Johnson. Johnson could not have created the crisis of self-definition that finally arrived, or fully arrived, in Selma. But a week after Selma, he could summarize the massive forces that were unleashed in American life and set a political agenda for the country. At times, he said, history and fate meet at a single time to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord, so it was a century ago at Appomattox, so it was last week in Selma, Alabama. Johnson, without reservation, put the full weight of the American tradition and the full force of the federal government on the side of the civil rights movement at a pivot point in American history. And Taylor Branch's account of this is really quite extraordinary because he has vignettes of the reaction when Lyndon Johnson says, "We shall overcome," in the offices of segregationist governors, in the headquarters of civil rights groups, and talks about how it changed the atmosphere the political atmosphere on this issue. I think that in the right circumstances, rhetoric can make that kind of difference. It was true of Martin Luther King in the shadow of Lincoln, shaping the meaning of events by explaining them, as Lincoln did at Gettysburg. It was true of Robert Kennedy's reaction when King was killed in his Indianapolis speech, speaking for unity against anger and revenge. Really an extraordinary moment. There are many academic concerns and criticisms about the power of public persuasion and the limits of the bully pulpit. We are in a degraded political environment where the exercise of presidential leadership can itself be polarizing. If President Obama elected tomorrow to come out and speak for a week on the importance of malaria control, the Republican Party would probably come out against funding it. So there are clearly, I think, polarization has limited the rhetorical power of the president. I think distrust of institutions over time has probably limited the rhetorical power of the president. But that can be overplayed. And I'll just mention a few areas, historical areas, categories where I think rhetoric makes some difference. It makes a difference, for example, in the choosing of leaders. Sometimes a political party is not trying to persuade Americans to support gun control or to support Social Security. It's making a decision between this guy and that guy. And rhetoric can be essential to that choice. It was essential to the rise of Barack Obama at the Democratic Convention in 2004, in the rise of William Jennings Bryan, or the rise of Lincoln above his contemporaries. I think rhetoric can make a difference in shaping the nature and priorities of the parties themselves. So consider what I consider one of the great convention speeches of all time, Hubert Humphrey's speech to the Democratic Convention in 1948, which caused 38 delegates from Mississippi to walk out, but I think shamed his party and helped determine its direction. Or Ronald Reagan's speech for Barry Goldwater in the last days of the 1964 election, which did not save Barry Goldwater, but had political reverberations for decades. And I think Reagan may not have created the Reagan Revolution, but he gave it an institutional home, and that matters in American politics. I think sometimes speeches can introduce new topics that shape public debates. This was true of Kennedy's American University speech and the test ban. It was true also, whether you agree with it or not, of Ronald Reagan and his SDI speech in 1983. The whole political class, the whole world, had to react to presidential priorities. And I did see an example of this with the president in the 2003 State of the Union address. I helped craft the words that announced the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. $15 billion to provide AIDS treatment and care, mainly in Africa. No one expected this from Bush, and very few in the political class on Capitol Hill demanded it. It had little relationship to immediate strategic objectives of the United States. And it would not have been on the agenda unless the President of the United States wanted it on the agenda. And has saved millions of lives. And maybe that is one argument in favor of transformational leadership sometimes, visionary leadership. And I also think that there's some useful presidential role in summarizing and articulating large trends that he doesn't create, that he recognizes he doesn't create. This, in many ways, was John Kennedy's role in the first inaugural, giving compelling, poetic expression to Cold War doctrines carefully shaped by Truman and Eisenhower, who did not specialize in explaining things through poetry. And you might argue the same in an entirely different context for Richard Nixon's silent majority speech, which gave definition to a cultural backlash against some of the trends of the 1960s that shaped American politics for decades. But I don't want to overstate the case, and we can get into this discussion later. We have just seen an example, a vivid example of my initial point. On Tuesday night, President Obama did not have a rhetorical problem. He had a reality problem. He was attempting to reassert American credibility in a foreign policy crisis while engaging in a forced concession, the postponement of military strikes that lacked national and international support. So, the beginning and the ending of the speech were an argument for strikes based on American exceptionalism, and the rest was an exception why those strikes would not be forthcoming. There was no rhetorical way to square this circle. He had a reality problem that even his strongest that made even his strongest words sound hollow. And this was true because he was operating from, and without judging the policy, was operating from a position of strategic weakness. He was isolated in the world community, rejected by the Congress and by the public, and on the verge of a historical defeat of his proposed strikes. And words had a little magic to change that. Thank you.
Thank you. Liz?
Thanks so much. I thought that if I was on the panel with a speechwriter, I would be the skeptic on the role of rhetoric. But I will give you, I thought what I would do is talk a little bit about the role of rhetoric and the role of leadership in the context of moving public opinion and the limits of leaders' ability to move public opinion, and then ask the question, well, if they're not speaking to the public or they're not able to move the public, who are they talking to? Who is the audience for rhetoric? Because if we start with we can start with a puzzle that I think will sort of highlight why we need to ask this question. So scholars of American politics don't agree about much, but they do agree that elites lead mass opinion, that the public is basically not very knowledgeable about most policies, and especially about foreign policy. They just don't know a whole lot about it, and they really don't vote about it. They don't go to the voting booth and say, okay, what did this guy do in the last 4 years on foreign policy? Most of the time. There are exceptions, but most of the time. And foreign policy just doesn't end up playing that direct a role in our domestic democratic politics. So consider the bump in job approval that President Obama got from the killing of Osama bin Laden. It went away in a matter of weeks. Same thing with the killing of Gaddafi in Libya. And more broadly, we know from cross-national political science research that leaders are not in general rewarded for doing well in foreign policy. Just ask George H.W. Bush or Winston Churchill. And they're also not very often punished for their failures. So it's just not the case that foreign policy ends up making that much difference in the end. And the public is relatively uninformed. On the other hand, it's also true that leaders and presidents behave as if the public matters a lot. And they spend a lot of time and resources and money paying people like Mike to, probably not enough money, to craft speeches. And they go round and around and around about what to put in, and clearly rhetoric matters on some level, or they wouldn't spend their scarce presidential time on it. So how can we reconcile these two things? I think it's important to look at the audience. Who is it that a lot of this rhetoric is aimed at? And here I think there is something that scholars of voting behavior can teach us. And that is that we're all busy people. And the way we try to make sense of a complicated world is by taking our cues from people we trust. And if you've all done this in your own lives, you're probably here because you're interested in international affairs. Maybe you don't keep up on some other issues like healthcare reform or malaria policy or pick an issue, right? Even IR scholars can't keep up on every issue. What do? We call up a trusted friend or colleague and ask them, okay, you know a lot about Syria, what do you think, right? Or you're a China expert, educate me on this topic. It's a shortcut, right? People take cues from people they trust. And that's the way voters make sense of foreign policy. They take cues from elites that they trust, and they tend to do it on partisan grounds, right? So if you're a Democrat, you in general will take your foreign policy cues from Democratic leaders, and vice versa if you're a Republican. And in some sense, this is perfectly rational behavior, right? And many Democratic theorists have pointed this out, right? This is essentially a problem of delegation. And what you want to know if you're a voter is, when is something going sufficiently wrong that I ought to pay attention? And that's what we use elite cues for, right? So you want to know, this is a moment where I should educate myself because there's a national crisis that is of sufficient importance, and the guy running the show is not doing a good job. So people tend to look to trusted elites as a shortcut, and they use partisan identification usually as a shortcut. And Joe's already mentioned another sort of critical piece of information, which is that the bully pulpit, presidential speeches and national addresses and the like, tend not to move the needle of mass opinion very much. And he mentioned the work of George Edwards, which has been quite eloquent on this issue. So again, who is the audience? So I would argue that it's elites that are often the primary audience for a lot of this presidential rhetoric. And the reason is because presidents want to control the environment of elite cues. They want to have some say over who goes on the Sunday morning talk shows and validates their policy or who criticizes it. And they know that people will be looking to their party leaders and other important elites, like military leaders in wartime, or even bureaucrats in their own administration, for the lead on how they should form and express their opinions about foreign policy. And so if the president can convince key elites on an issue, he's going to have an easier time bringing the public along. And so we really ought to be thinking in many cases about elites as the audience, because after all, a crucial speech like the one Jeff Sachs discusses in this book is not going to be read in its entirety by the majority of Americans. It's going to be filtered through the news media, and it's going to be picked up on by other elites. And so that, I think, is a critical thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about rhetoric. And so I have a somewhat skeptical take on the role of the bully pulpit to actually, and for presidents to actually move public opinion purely in the sense of moving the needle, right? What percentage of people agree or disagree with the president on policy X, as Mike said. But that's not the only way, as Mike has also said, that rhetoric can matter. But there is a catch, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. So you want to try to keep these elites on board so that they don't criticize you, or maybe they'll help validate your policy. But in order to do that, you may have to convince them by accommodating their preferences, right? So there may be an important bargaining process that goes on behind the scenes in many cases that allows presidents to keep key elites on board that might otherwise be skeptical, or get them on board, or at least keep them from speaking out. Now that process could involve bargaining, side payments, horse trading on other issues, or it could involve implementing a policy in a way that accommodates key elites. May not be exactly what the president wants, but those policy concessions are the way that he's able to go forward. And that catch can have really important consequences on the ground. And so I'll just talk about a few examples of this. And I think Sachs's book actually has a really good one to start off with, and that highlights the fact that Kennedy understood this process quite well. So take the example of the test ban treaty. So in Jeff Sachs's book, he discusses how Kennedy spent a lot of time going to Congress, but he also knew that a critical constituency was the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And if he couldn't get the Joint Chiefs on board, he'd have a problem. In the first instance, he'd have a problem with Congress, a bigger problem than he already had. And then he might ultimately have a problem with the American people. Because after all, the goal is to bring the public on board. The question is, how do you do that if the public is not paying attention? Right? So he knew that he had to bring the JCS inside the tent. And in order to do that, he agreed to 4 safeguards. And one of them was an aggressive underground testing program. And that, we can get into the specifics of that, but I think Sachs's book highlights that there were unintended consequences to these safeguards, right? That once testing went underground, it became less of an issue, and that allowed future nuclear arms buildup that maybe wasn't the ultimate intention of the test ban treaty itself. So the policy concession necessary to bring the JCS inside the tent and keep them sort of in the constellation of validating the president's policy ends up having important policy consequences down the line. So how can we think about this in terms of presidents moving policy and public opinion and leadership. So an example where presidents have been able to successfully build an elite coalition to move a policy forward when the public was arguably not at all in favor of it, the surges in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan is a somewhat cleaner example because it occurred in a first term, whereas the Bush surge was a second term, so it's a little harder to say what the domestic political incentives were. So just focusing for a minute here on Obama's Afghanistan surge. I think you could make a pretty good case that Obama's preference was more in line with those of Joe Biden. So a more limited counterterrorism strategy, right? His view of military intervention has been, in general, quite limited. But he had inside the administration 3 key members of his team who had a very high public profile: Petraeus, Bob Gates, and Hillary Clinton, all of whom could be effective cue givers in the media. And their preferences were much more in line with a counterinsurgency strategy. And if you believe the publicly available counts, which is sort of all we have at the moment until Mark can get his hands on the documents in 30 years or whatever, there was an intense process of bargaining to go just enough towards the Gates, Clinton, Petraeus position to keep them on board. And that, I would argue, has important policy consequences because it may have been a suboptimal policy for actually fighting the war in Afghanistan itself. But he was able to fly up to West Point, and one of the more interesting vignettes in Bob Woodward's book is the moment where he actually insists that they all go up together and they all fly on Air Force One, and it gives the Secret Service a heart attack because the entire national security team is all on the same plane. But he wants, and there's a picture of them, they're all sitting in the front row, because he wants to demonstrate that everyone is on board with this policy. Once the bargaining is over, then that's it, and everybody has to support it. But the policy gets watered down in sort of a least common denominator way along the way. But he's able to pursue the surge. Now, you may think the surge is good or bad, but the point is he's able to move from a sort of policy enactment perspective, he's able to enact his policy despite polls that show significant public war weariness. And arguably, George W. Bush was able to do the same thing, reaching out to a very unorthodox group of elites and keeping some skeptical members of the team on board, including George Casey, who was the commander in Iraq at the time and skeptical of the surge to some extent, at a moment where the public was very much turning against the Iraq war. So those are examples where presidents were able to move forward with a policy by accommodating other elites, and yet the public was still skeptical. An example, it's important to note that this doesn't always work, right? Presidents can be good or bad at this. And one of the great ironies of the Vietnam War, to me, is how a president like Lyndon Johnson, who came to office with such skill in managing other elites, from a very successful career in Congress, could have been so terrible at this in the context of Vietnam. But that's, we could be here all day. Examples where this didn't really work so well and where elite opinion constrained the president when the public was relatively permissive. I would argue Reagan's intervention in Lebanon is such a case where public opinion was not especially supportive, but it was tepid, but it was not overtly hostile. And in fact, it rallied a little bit after the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut. But congressional opinion, especially within Reagan's own party, began to sour on the intervention, and he saw the writing on the wall and pulled out before public opinion really turned against the intervention. And I think that's a case where you see elites out in front of the public, and a president really responding in the first instance to elite opinion, which may be quite different from mass opinion. And of course, we've heard many times already today that Woodrow Wilson was another example of failure to bring other elites along. So overall, what does this mean for the role of leadership in presidential rhetoric? Well, in terms of movement of public opinion, I think it means that, as Mike has already pointed out, the bully pulpit has limits. It's often not very powerful unless it's moving along with events. But it doesn't mean it's not effective at all. And in fact, many of these speeches may be designed precisely to appeal to other elites. You go make a session a speech to a joint session of Congress, maybe it's Congress you're actually trying to talk to. And I'd be curious to hear Mike's thoughts about what audience you're trying to reach. But there's actually been some pretty good research suggesting that signaling to your own administration, signaling to key opinion leaders is part of the function of presidential speeches. So that's one point. Another point is that, and going back to Joe's point about dogs that don't bark, when you see leaders with their ducks in a row, right? They've got everything, they've got all their, the other key elites lined up with them, and the public seems to be going along. That's not always an accident, right? It may have taken a lot of domestic political work to make that happen, and you just don't see it until people like Mark and others uncover it in historical accounts. But the bargaining that goes on behind the scenes may be the leadership that we don't see, right? So just because you don't see it in a national address doesn't mean there's not important rhetorical and other leadership moves happening that create that appearance of unity. It doesn't come from nowhere, right? So rhetoric matters, but I think it's really important to keep in mind the audience that rhetoric is aimed at, and that to bring the public along, presidents may be focused on a different audience in the first instance, which may be a pretty small number of elites even in a democracy. And I would argue that's actually okay from a democratic perspective, because after all, we do elect these elites, and it is rational. We are all busy people. We can't keep up with everything, and we are delegating our foreign policy in many cases to a fairly small number of elites. Now, things doesn't mean mistakes can't be made, but the counterfactual we need to ask ourselves is, would we have done any better if we voted referendum style on foreign policy at each and every turn? I don't know. Would we do, as a collective, would we do better? I'm not sure. So I'm okay with delegating to other elites, as long as we get to throw the bums out every 4 years if we want to. So.
Well, that's fascinating. Let me try to get an exchange between the two of you. Mike, you picked up the point that Elizabeth makes, which I think is an important one, which is the intervening role of elites, trusted elites. But sometimes presidents decide just to ignore the elites too. If you look at George W. Bush's decision on the surge in Iraq, what strikes me is that it was a very bold move, very gutsy move, where he didn't have much support in his own administration or in the elites. And again, this is just going by public accounts, but you know, his top generals were not supporting it. It wasn't. You had this commission that had been created. I guess it was. I can't remember the name of it. Lee Hamilton and so forth, which was an effort, first of all, to gather these elites and have them all say, "Get out of Iraq."
It was the establishment.
Yeah, it was the establishment. So it was what you described of, let's gather the elites and get them to support this. And the president says, that's not me. That's not what I want. And so he makes a decision, which one can disagree or agree with the larger Iraq policy, but on this particular point of deciding to have a surge rather than accepting the establishment elites, you know, way out. How does that work? In other words, if Elizabeth's right that you line up the elites, what happens when a president says, sorry, the elites aren't going where I want them to, and I know what's right, and I'm going to do it? I mean, tell us, try to apply.
It's tough because there are a couple of different responses. One of them is it was even worse than that, because the majority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, came to the President of the United States in the Oval Office and said, you're destroying the Republican Party, we need to get out of Iraq. There was considerable political pressure applied from his own party leadership. The President did not react well to that in the meeting, and in a way that you're talking about, which is, I don't make decisions this way, or based on politics, I'm trying to determine the national interest, and he bristled at it. But he also, there was an internal process to bring elites, internal elites within the government around to the president's point of view. It was not as stark as this. So there was an internal policy review process headed by Steve Hadley and including a lot of people from within the departments that, where people were traveling to Iraq and getting information from commanders on the ground and building an internal case to try to persuade not the American public, but to try to affect a shift within the thinking of the administration itself. And the president ended up being, as I remember it, fairly skillful in managing the opponents of the surge, which were really Casey and Abizade. Okay.
Casey became Army Chief of Staff.
Right, exactly. So part of it was kicking people upstairs, not humiliating them. Okay, that was a very Lincolnian kind of maneuver in that way. Is that, he did not make Casey and Abizade he believed they were wrong. He did not force a process by which they were humiliated in the process, in that decision-making process. So that's, I think, those are transactional skills, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're, but I think it points to a greater reality here, which is, I don't think the president can go it completely alone, but he doesn't need majorities of the American people to do things. The President of the United States does not need 51% of the vote on any given day to take important actions in what he regards as the national interest. But he does need credibility to do them. Internal credibility within his own system, and then credibility within Washington where people will support that. He eventually ended, even after the surge was implemented, there were serious attempts in the Congress to defund and undermine it. It was a continual campaign. And then the person who became key to turning that around was General Petraeus in his testimony to Congress. And so some of it is having key allies that are effective in making that case. So it was a mix here. I think the analogy might be Truman-like in a certain way. I mean, Harry Truman did not end his presidency as a popular president, okay? Pursuing a indecisive Asian war, and having broad critiques of his foreign policy approach. But he had the power in the office and the legitimacy and the team that allowed him to pursue important policies. And sometimes that's what you're left with when you're a president, and that's why almost every president, and Barack Obama will be in the same boat, will end up saying history will justify me, because the public often does not. So.
I completely agree with that, and I mean, far be it from me, my first book was called Leaders at War, right? I believe leaders can basically do what they want, so I think the key is figuring out in the first instance what the president wants to do, and then what he thinks he can get away with politically so he doesn't get kicked out of office, which is quite a lot when you think about how rarely foreign policy ends up mattering for an election. And then secondarily, how much he can pursue other aspects of his agenda if he loses credibility in Washington. And so what you frequently see is presidents doing what they want and yet making side accommodations in order to maintain their credibility. The problem is occasionally those side accommodations can have unintended consequences. So a great example from Kennedy and the Vietnam War is appointing Henry Cabot Lodge to be the ambassador in Saigon, right? Which of course accelerated the process of the coup, as we talked about this morning, against Siem. Now, maybe Kennedy might have decided to go ahead with it anyway. As one historian has put it, he wanted to keep all his options open, but not deciding, was effectively deciding to go forward with the coup. But Lodge was there sort of pushing everything faster than Kennedy wanted. But the reason to put him in there in the first place was to have a Republican to validate and share the blame. And it's incredibly rare to have a president actually acknowledge domestic political motives. But if you want to study this problem, you should study Lyndon Johnson, because Lyndon Johnson would actually say that stuff into the dictaphone. And Johnson is on record as having said, we cannot get Lodge, we have to keep Lodge there, because if we don't keep him there, he's just going to use what he's what were doing against us in 1964, and we had better build the record to show that we backed every suggestion that came in every cable from launch. Now, maybe you didn't really mean that, but it's still an extraordinary thing for a president to actually say. Nonetheless, Johnson kind of did more or less what he wanted. So I think presidents can have a lot of autonomy, particularly in foreign policy, but they can sometimes get blowback from the accommodations they have to make in order to maintain their credibility.
And it's a little bit frightening, particularly on the foreign policy side, how arbitrary that process is. I was talking to people involved in the Afghan surge decision, and there was an element about the final number that was a split the difference element.
Goldilocks.
Right. Do we really make military planning decisions that way? Well, yeah, we pretty much do. And it relates very much to that process, because that was an internal negotiation in which General Petraeus got himself into huge trouble at one point because he gave me a quote for a column I did where he called for a fully resourced counterinsurgency strategy and was called to the Oval Office to be called on the carpet about. That was a massive internal debate. I mean, a take no prisoners, where people on both sides were leaking classified information to discredit the other side in the internal discussion. And then you end up with a result that seems fairly arbitrary. It can be kind of scary.
Elizabeth, let me ask you a question about your model before we throw it open to the audience, and then Mike can comment on it as well. One of the things that has struck me about the 12 years since 9/11 is how extraordinary it is that American opinion has shifted as far as it has. In other words, if you imagine the question of somebody raising an issue of striking Syria with a limited strike in 2003 or 4 or whatever, the deference to the president would probably be quite complete. The idea that you couldn't get that through a Congress either with a Republican or a Democratic party, in other words, that both parties were unwilling to support it, it's quite extraordinary. And how, one way you could argue that the polls would show that mass opinion has changed more than elite opinion. In other words, if on the trusted elites, I haven't seen exact polls on this, but I suspect just from reading columns and so forth, that if you did a poll of columnists and academics and foreign policy experts, you probably would have had more support for strike against Libya than you got in the general public. So in that case, if the general public is very strongly against, I think the Congress in that is reflecting the general public. And but how could Obama have followed a process of using trusted elites if the public's not already trusting the elites? In other words, you think of the trust problem. If the public has gotten to the view that when the president says this will be a limited strike, and the public says, I've heard that before. And I've been struck by the number of people, including members of my own family, who say, it won't stay limited. And I said, why not? And they, well, just, we just learned that these things never stay limited. If the public mood is one of mistrust, how does the president use trusted elites? In other words, your model is public doesn't know much. President uses trusted elites to deal with the public. Suppose public knows a lot or thinks it knows a lot, even if it's wrong, and the trusted elites know something else, then what's the president do?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I've actually done some research on this, somewhat unintentionally. So last November, a colleague and I did put a bunch of survey questions in the survey where we divided the respondents up and gave them a cue, gave them the same information, but varied who the messenger was. So many experts, or many Democratic experts, or many Republican experts, or didn't have any experts. So an experiment. And we asked a whole range of foreign policy issues, including a humanitarian intervention in Syria. Now, the question wording was not exactly like what's been going on here, but it was relatively close. And we found that basically nobody was moved by any cue, unlike a lot of the other issues in our survey. And we actually reran it 2 weeks ago when this crisis began, and still, the public is an immovable rock on this issue. You cannot move public opinion, which is quite striking in light of the huge amount of evidence we have in lots of other instances that the public is fairly movable on these issues. So I think in this case, I would attribute that to war weariness. But I think there are 2 points to be made about the model and presidential leadership that follow from it. One, I don't think, I think what the public is probably reacting to is going into Syria at all. But I think the details of limited strike or humanitarian strike or spillover effects, all the stuff that is consuming the Beltway and the people in this room as we debate it, it's not that the public is stupid. It's not at all that the public is stupid. It's that that's just costly information for people to acquire, and they're not engaging with the debate at that level. So they're reacting to going into Syria or not. And so if you could construct a coalition in favor of some sort of strike, and I think that would help a lot, because you would then have something more concrete to take to the public, as opposed to this generic question of going in or not. The second point to be made, though, is I'm not sure how much it matters. As Mike said, you don't need public backing. Depends on what you want to do. And if he just wanted to launch cruise missiles 2 weeks ago, I think he could have done that.
I agree with
with very little political consequence. I still think it's a second-term president. The only question is how it impacts the rest of his agenda. I think the debate has elevated the issue, maybe in ways he never intended, but I'm still not sure what the constraining effect of the public is in this case, which is not to say that we should be routinely ignoring what the public wants, especially on an issue of war and peace. But I think the historical record suggests it just isn't going to make that much difference.
It is somewhat reminiscent of the 1930s, though. If you think of Franklin Roosevelt, his various efforts to convince public opinion, he had some trusted elites, particularly the closer you got to war, but basically he could not get the public to change. I mean, it was just very hard.
Americans viewed World War I as a failure generally, didn't they?
Yes.
I mean, the
Big mistake. There were, there were congressional hearings, the Nye Committee, not a close relative, which developed this whole theory that it was a conspiracy, a mistake, so there was a strong reaction against it, and it's a little bit, I think. I mean, we may be seeing in the 30s the reaction against World War I. Sorry, in the 30s we might have been seeing the reaction to World War I. Now I think we're seeing the reaction to Iraq and Afghanistan. And I guess the question maybe for you, Mike, is what do you do? I mean, how do we get out of that? Do we just have to wait, as Roosevelt waited, until Pearl Harbor comes? Or what do you do?
It's difficult.
What does any president
It's
do?
difficult because you have a war weariness that is understandable, and a set of global challenges that don't care if we have war weariness. Okay? They're not related to one another.
Right.
They're just different things. And that puts in the president in some difficult circumstances. It's not new. I mean, I think Iraq played an important role in this. And it was true not just now, but during the Bush administration. And so I was very close to how we were dealing with Sudan policy. And you had huge resistance to any type of engagement to deal with the results of genocide in Sudan, from the military that felt overextended, from key congressional people, from a variety of others. It's a serious kind of challenge, and the president in those circumstances, decides what is essential to American interests and what is not, and what risks do I want to take. Now, Congress provides, just so you know, mixed messages on this. So 2 days ago, Peter Baker's front page story in the New York Times on this, it doesn't quote directly, but quotes Democratic congressional leaders saying to him, "I just wish Obama had bombed." Okay. they didn't particularly want that responsibility in this if they felt like it was
Yeah.
important to the national interest. And that's a dark side of the way the Congress relates to these issues. I mean, they're, they, on the surface, will demand to be more engaged in foreign policy decision-making, and then often they are deeply resistant to be involved in that process and would rather the president take those roles.
To me, that's the most amazing thing about about the decision to go to Congress in the first place in Syria, because the War Powers Resolution to me has become a safe institution for receiving criticism about military intervention. So you complain that you weren't consulted, and then the president doesn't really consult or just notifies under the WPR, and then Congress doesn't have to vote, and the president gets what he wants, and everyone goes home happy, right? I mean, that's essentially how most of the sort of smaller scale interventions have gone. And
It's interesting,
Yeah.
a de facto constitutional amendment. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody says Congress shall declare war, except the War Powers Act, which was designed to limit the executive, in fact, expanded the role for the executive.
Yeah.
Well, we should be throwing it open to the audience for our questions that you all may have to the panel. So thoughts, we can get microphones shifted around if people have questions or, yes, over here.
This question is from Mr. Gerson.
Mhm.
I was wondering how public opinion polls or public opinion in general influences a presidential, the way in which he speaks to the American people. I'm thinking primarily of Reagan, his Reagan Revolution victory in 1980. His speeches then were intelligently and practically very different than they were in right after Iran-Contra. Just as, I see a difference actually today in from Obama and his first few speeches to just the other day speaking about Syria, talking to the American public. Would you say there's a real difference between the two of them, or just, I guess, a two-layered question?
I think the best way to respond, Reagan is a good example. He had a long history of sometimes disturbingly extreme ideological argumentation that changed dramatically in his successful presidential run and then as president, particularly as related to entitlement programs or to other things. So there are just adjustments you do in moving from an ideological leader to a political leader that are fairly natural. I think that Barack Obama made not as extreme but similar adjustments in his attitude towards Iraq. I mean, he wanted a complete withdrawal from Iraq in a very short amount of time, which was not a particularly realistic proposal, but it was important to his ideological constituency, particularly when he was running against someone who had voted for the Iraq War. And he was taking advantage of that. And so I think that there's a transition that goes on. Reagan strikes me as an example. I don't believe, just from my own historical analysis, and I'll have to defer, that Ronald Reagan created the Reagan Revolution through argumentation. These were broad social trends that had to do with resentment of high tax rates, failure of liberal state and city governments, in California or in New York City or a lot of other places, concerns about crime and social order, and these are just very, very broad issues. But he had this skillful ability as an ideological leader to both tap into that discontent, but do so in a way that didn't eventually alienate kind of middle ground voters who felt like they could vote for him that he was not frightening. That I think is a part of his tremendous talent. He was if you look at the history of his statements on Social Security or Medicare or other things, they were indeed extreme. And then his governing style was accommodated social and economic realities. I would also say that I wouldn't discount the role that the inflation crisis played in the election of Ronald Reagan, an objective economic circumstance. His first inaugural speech is not an inspiring speech. It is a hard economic speech about monetary policy, okay, which he thought these policies were a threat to the American way of life, a threat to the country. So I think that was part of it as well, that he was responding to a genuine economic crisis that allowed him an opportunity. Now, I want to digress, but he also did help legitimize a series of arguments on tax rates that Jack Kempen made and others and supply-side people had made that were initially marginal arguments in the 1970s and 80s that he helped bring to the center of American politics. And then through the use of the persuasive power of the presidency, passed significant tax cuts. It was, that was an ideological achievement, but it was, a limited one, not a complete reconsideration of, the New Deal and the Great Society, which Americans were not willing to do.
Other questions? Yes, Tim.
Thanks a lot. I had a question for the panel. I think in response to Michael's reference to Obama's speech on Tuesday, where all the structural factors are lined up against the president, and even a wonderful speaker like Obama, Rhetoric, can't move the needle in this way. Can we think of examples where the opposite was the case, where everything, all the structural factors were lining up to make a policy outcome that the president wanted, and then the president just flubs it? I mean, are there examples where, rhetoric has a very negative impact on what the president wants to do? Presidents have to give speeches, they can't avoid it. So they can, maybe give a boilerplate speech and the outcome will not be changed, but are there also negative examples of just, blown speeches? Or do we say, look, rhetoric doesn't really matter, you can really blow a speech. I'm not asking you to justify your years and years writing speeches, but I'm just wondering if there are different ways we can think about the impact of rhetoric and speeches beyond the really high bar of everything's going against you. Can you come up with that magical turn of phrase that suddenly turns popular opinion from very negative to popular?
Somewhere there must be among the guild of speechwriters a classified list of speeches that
Duds.
made things worse, not better.
Jimmy Carter's
Yeah,
malaise.
Jimmy Carter's
Carter.
malaise,
Yeah.
because he had a kind of perception of leadership that was actually reinforced by
But
the speech.
I immediately thought of that, but I would love to go and actually look at the polling numbers to see whether there was in fact a drop. Now, maybe there was in that case, but,
And
you
I can
wonder-
imagine extemporaneous, communications in
Yeah.
crisis where, it's probably not a good idea to say, I'm not a crook. That's not very effective communication. But that was not a case where things were going swimmingly and he blew them. That
Maybe the way it happens more is the speech is given and then the spin, defines it as, Malay's speech was a disaster, even when, the public opinion polls don't necessarily show it that way. This must be something as a speechwriter you have to deal with, so you're anticipating how this is going to be seen.
I wish I had a better answer. I don't.
Yeah.
Can you think
I know,
of historical examples?
It's hard to think of. Take Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative speech, which for the small group who were true believers in SDI, it was a great success. On the other hand, it launched a counter-movement. People who were skeptical of SDI, who then characterized it or mischaracterized it as Star Wars, and it probably made it harder rather than easier. In other words, Reagan is a great rhetorician, but he makes a speech about strategic defense initiative which was not ripe technologically. In other words, whatever you think about missile defense, and there are things to be said for missile defense, the full-blown Edward Teller missile defense, most people, including as viewed by many friends I had in the Reagan administration, said it wasn't quite there. Now, some of them said, but it's done great things for us in terms of frightening the Russians. I mean, that's a net benefit. But it hasn't done great things for us in terms of getting support for our agenda at home. So, I mean, that's a mixed type.
Can I ask whether you would put the misstatements by the Truman administration that South Korea is not within our sphere of
Yeah.
influence
Yeah, Atchison
following World War II?
speech.
Drawing
in,
the line
yeah.
and saying, if you stay
Yeah.
on this side of the line, you're
Yeah.
okay.
That
That's-
invited a
That was,
disaster.
yeah, January 1950, that was, yeah.
I was thinking also, who was the president who gave the inaugural that went on for hours, then he caught a cold and
Harrison,
died?
Benjamin Harrison.
That one.
Yeah, that was
Maybe
an
not.
immediate punishment for. Yeah.
But to me, well, can I just add when I was reading Sachs's book, to me, the really interesting counterfactual is, what if the ideas contained in the American University speech had not been given as a speech? What if he'd just written them as a letter to Khrushchev? Would it have had the same impact? Now, I get, one extreme would be, yes, it would have had the same impact because it was the content of the policy and not the fact that it was rhetorically delivered, a good piece of rhetoric that mattered. The other extreme is, no, it had to be given in a public setting and reported and so forth. To me, the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, right? Because simply putting it in a letter is not as credible because you are not exposing it to public scrutiny, and you're not going to get, Khrushchev's not going to believe that you are willing to incur political costs. But it's not clear to me what the immediate impact of it was on the mass public, and it probably had in the short run a bigger impact on those who followed arms control and so forth, would be my guess.
Yes.
Thank you. What about a surfeit of rhetoric? And I'm thinking specifically now of Obama, who over the years is very intellectual explanations of things have, in some cases, put people to sleep. And certainly nobody follows the Obamacare explanations. But that's domestic. And in terms of today, in terms of Syria, hasn't his multiple messages cast him as a flip-flopper, wanting to hide perhaps behind Congress, lost him the trust of everyone, the public, and
You want to start on it?
I have my own view on this. I think the president has attempted to clarify his communications. Part of what he wanted to do in his speech to the country is to clarify his communications by narrowing his topic. So instead of dealing with the range of strategic challenges in the Middle East or the broad suffering of the Syrian people or other things, he focused on the norm against conventional chemical weapons, maintaining that international norm. And it was almost the exclusive focus of his remarks. So that was a rhetorical strategy that I think is, they want to try, but he also thinks he can be more successful by narrowing the mission. It's exactly the approach that he took in Afghanistan. I'm going to narrow the mission to kind of, to Al-Qaeda and counterinsurgency, and I'm going to look what the appropriate means are. It's one of his methods. I have a critique, which I make in the Post this morning, that has a moral hazard because people destroyed by, children killed by Scud missiles, fired at civilian populations that don't get on YouTube are also a serious problem. And it has a strategic hazard because we have a bunch of interests in the region that have, that are not just related to chemical weapons, the stability of key allies, trying to limit, the ambitions and influence of Iran, Hezbollah, the Syrian regime, or whatever arguments you want to make. There are big picture items. So the president decided in his speech not to come in and say, I've got a strategic approach, like a Truman Doctrine, that's a multi-pronged effort to meet our strategic challenges in the Middle East. He tried to say, we're doing chemical weapons. And it's simple to understand. It's an indiscriminate weapon and an important national norm, and I'm just doing this. But I actually think the strategy itself has some of its own risks. So,
Elizabeth, you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think from a domestic, just pure, taking the moral and strategic implications of it, which I think, make a lot of sense. Mike's interpretation of it makes a lot of sense. I think from a purely domestic political standpoint, it probably will not make that much difference, especially if some sort of deal with the Russians goes forward, which could end up sort of making it look like somewhat of a win. I just don't think the public is paying that close attention to the nuances of the different kinds of strategy. And so, especially if he's able to get the endorsement of key leaders in Congress and so forth for whatever the final outcome is, probably be okay. I mean, obviously he's not up for re-election, but even in terms of approval and his agenda, and I mean, it'll have eaten up time that could have been spent on other things, so he's burning political capital, which is, a cost of its own. But I don't think it'll make that much difference in terms of domestic politics. I do think that when it looked as though they were going to go forward with the resolution before all this stuff with the Russians happened, there were signs that the need to accommodate key elites might have caused some of the dynamics that you are raising. So there was the need to accommodate McCain's preference to expand. At the same time, they were trying to thread a very, and they still might have to. I mean, we've been here all day. I haven't kept up. What's the latest? Threading that needle between those who want to go in and who are annoyed at him because he's not doing enough versus those who are annoyed because he's doing too much. It's a very, very tough needle to thread. Incidentally, the same problem, the exit polls in the New Hampshire primary in 1968, which is supposedly the election that was the anti-war election, research shows that, in fact, half the people thought Lyndon Johnson was doing too much or against the war. The other half thought he wasn't doing enough. This is just within New Hampshire primary. So presidents face this problem a lot, and I think this is a little bit unusual only insofar as the threading has been quite public. But I don't think it's going to make that much difference in the end.
Yes.
Hello. So my questions are to the whole panel. So in what degree, if any, do you think that persistent attitudes of sexism and racism have affected the way that prominent politicians like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, who are both, I guess women are not technically a minority, but how they use their rhetoric? I think, you commented earlier that Obama's been can sometimes be a little intellectual and boring, or no drama Obama. And sometimes I wonder if that's because he wants to avoid being angry and it has something to do with persistent racism in the United States. So I'm just wondering what you guys think about that.
Gosh.
Yeah, it's a tough topic. This is I don't think that Barack Obama, from everything I know about him, has shaped and crafted a public image to fit perceptions of racism in society. I don't have a relationship with him, but I do know people who do, and this is the way he is. In public and private, he's cerebral, he views things, he wants to have an orderly process. He's very, very much comes out of an academic atmosphere and his approach. I agree with the analysis that sometimes that he can be professorial, which here at Columbia I don't want to necessarily dismiss completely, but it hasn't necessarily been the most persuasive form of communication on some topics. But I guess if I were to, I think that relates more to internal dynamics of his own person, development, background, training, and I think it was one of the main items of his appeal, or one of the main sources of his appeal in in his first election. We saw this revealed at the height of the economic meltdown when John McCain was all over the map. He was proposing this, he was blaming this person, he was calling to suspend the campaign, he wanted to come to the White House. It was a spectacle. And Barack Obama's manner was very much like the one you were talking about in some of his foreign policy communications, and I think it helped him immensely in the closing days of that campaign. I would only, say that it's often the case that a leader's strengths, the things that bring them to prominence, can be weaknesses in a variety of different circumstances they face as President of the United States. And we can maybe seeing some of that dynamic. But I saw it without, I wouldn't be too harsh on it, but President Bush is one of the most loyal people I know to the people who work for him. And it makes you loyal to him. And then it came to the point where I felt that it was necessary for him to make changes for the Secretary of Defense, for key members of the leadership team, and what was really a strength, a personal character strength, may become a limitation on presidential leadership. And that's not unusual. Often, it's true in our own lives, sometimes our strengths are our weaknesses. So.
Elizabeth, any thoughts on sexism in campaigning?
Yeah, I
particularly
mean,
related to Hillary Clinton?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. These things are very hard to tease out, right? I mean, so we think about Hillary Clinton's Iraq War vote, which a lot of people point to as a real problem for her in 2008. Did she vote for the Iraq War? Let's just stipulate, for argument's sake, I have no idea if this is true. Stipulate that she probably wouldn't have voted for the war on her own volition. Now, maybe she would have, I don't know, but that's another thing it's hard to know. But for argument's sake, let's just suppose she didn't. Did she do it because she felt she had to look tough because she was a woman? Or did she do it because she was a Democrat and the political pressures on Democrats in 2002 was to vote with a popular president pursuing what was at the time a popular course of action? Very, very hard to know. I mean, I will say I have a colleague who does research on how the public views women candidates, and he's somewhat skeptical of the there's been some research that suggests that women are subjected to discussions of their clothing, women candidates and that sort of thing, and that actually has negative impact on the way, it doesn't really matter if people talk about it more if it doesn't affect the way people actually evaluate women candidates. But some people say it does, and his research suggests it doesn't. So I think that's still highly contested. I don't think we know. Stay tuned. But I think it's just these things are very hard to know. And if she runs again in 2016, it seems unlikely to me that that's still going to be an issue after all this time and 4 years of serving as a Secretary of Defense. At least it's unlikely that anything she does from then on is all to look tough, right? So.
Well, we've reached our final hour of 3 o'clock, and so it just remains for you to thank the two panelists for the fine job they've done.
Thank you.
And I just want to, again, thank the Earth Institute and the Institute for International Policy Fellows Program at SEPA, and all of you for coming, and all our panelists, some of whom were traveled up from D.C. specifically for this event, and again for Joe Nye for doing double duty. So thank the panelists, and thank you all.